My name is Elaine Porte. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people describe in ways that sound reassuring but never powerful. Dependable, level-headed, easy to work with. I'm a financial operations manager by profession, a wife by commitment, and the person others rely on when something needs to be handled quietly and correctly. I've never been the center of attention, and for a long time I thought that was a strength. People tend to underestimate women like me, not because we lack intelligence or backbone, but because we don't advertise either. I don't dominate conversations. I don't dramatize conflict. I listen more than I speak. And somewhere along the way, that calm was mistaken for consent. My silence was interpreted as agreement. My patience was assumed to be infinite. This story is not about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations, public scenes, or proving someone wrong in front of an audience. I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm here to tell the truth, slowly, honestly, and without spectacle. My husband spent our emergency savings without telling me. That sentence alone sounds like a betrayal, and in many ways it was. But what I want you to understand from the beginning is that the money itself wasn't the deepest wound. Money can be quantified. It can be recovered. What was lost that day was something far more fragile and far harder to restore. Trust breaks quietly then all at once. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how that break didn't happen in a single explosion, but through a series of small, reasonable moments. Moments that were easy to dismiss, easy to rationalize, easy to explain away as stress, miscommunication, or timing. I stayed quiet longer than I should have, not because I was weak, but because I believed stability mattered more than friction. This story traces how I became invisible in my own marriage while still carrying its weight, how being reliable slowly turned into being overlooked, how silence stopped being a virtue and became a habit that worked against me, and how emotional justice doesn't always arrive through confrontation or anger. Sometimes it arrives through awareness, preparation, and choice. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't paint anyone as a monster. Real life is more complicated than that. This is about how trust erodes when boundaries are crossed softly, and how clarity arrives not with shouting, but with stillness. You'll hear about who I was to the people around me, the role I was expected to play without discussion, and the moment I realized that keeping the peace was costing me something essential. If you've ever been the person others leaned on without asking how much weight you were carrying, if you've ever noticed a line crossed and told yourself it wasn't worth addressing, if you've ever realized too late that something important had been taken for granted, then this story may feel familiar. Before we continue, I want to ask you, quietly and honestly, have you ever dismissed a small moment only to realize later it was the beginning of a much larger break? Before anything broke, before money was moved and explanations were offered too late, I need you to understand who I was to the people around me, especially to my husband. To them, I was the steady one. I was the woman who remembered due dates without setting reminders out loud. The one who knew exactly how much was in each account. Not because I was controlling, but because someone had to know. I tracked our finances the way other people track weather, quietly, routinely, without panic. Emergencies didn't scare me. I prepared for them. That preparation became part of my identity. At family gatherings, I was the one people handed things to. Coats, bags, information, problems. Elaine will know. Elaine can handle it. It was never framed as a burden. It was presented as trust, and I accepted it that way. My husband used to introduce me proudly, but briefly. This is Elaine. She keeps us organized. Not brilliant, not strategic, just organized. At work, it was similar. I was dependable to the point of invisibility. When something went wrong, I was asked to fix it. When something went right, it was assumed it would have anyway. I wasn't underestimated openly. That would have been easier to push against. Instead, I was quietly categorized as safe, predictable, always there. I learned early that being useful earned approval faster than being complicated. In my marriage, I played the role without ever being formally assigned it. I handled the spreadsheets. I flagged potential issues. I suggested caution without insisting on it. When decisions were made, I supported them, even when my input had been minimal, because harmony mattered, or at least I thought it did. I told myself this was a partnership. If my husband forgot something important, I reminded him. If he overextended himself, I compensated. If he dismissed a concern I raised, I let it go. Not because I agreed, but because pushing felt unnecessary. I believed that if something truly mattered, he would listen eventually. I believed my consistency would speak for me. What I didn't realize was that consistency can become background noise. Over time, my role solidified. I was the foundation. Foundations don't get thanked. They're expected to hold. You don't consult them when you renovate. You assume they'll adapt. When friends talked about their relationships, they described compromises and negotiations. I listened and nodded, thinking I was simply less dramatic, more evolved. I told myself that not every thought needed to be voiced, that maturity meant choosing your battles. The truth is, I wasn't choosing. I was defaulting. There were moments, small ones, when I felt something tighten in my chest. A decision made without checking in. A joke that reduced my contribution to being good with numbers. A casual comment that implied my agreement where none had been asked for. Each time I told myself it wasn't worth the energy to correct. After all, nothing was wrong, not obviously. From the outside, our life looked balanced, stable, sensible. We weren't volatile. We didn't fight loudly. We didn't implode. People envied our calm. They told me how lucky I was to have a marriage without drama. And I believed them, because I didn't yet understand the difference between peace and silence. I thought being trusted meant being included. I didn't notice when trust turned into assumption, when my reliability became an excuse not to consult me, when my quiet became convenient. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I made everything easier for everyone else. And when you make yourself easy to rely on, people forget you're a person with limits. At that point in my life, I would have told you I was content. Not ecstatic, but grounded. I believed stability was the reward for being thoughtful, patient, and prepared. I believed that if something truly serious ever came up, I would be informed, because that's what partners do. I didn't know yet that my role had already been defined. Reliable, useful, invisible. And once a role like that settles in, it rarely announces when it starts to cost you something. The first time it happened, it didn't register as betrayal. That's important to say out loud because when people hear what my husband eventually did, they imagine a single dramatic moment, a sharp fracture, obvious and undeniable. But the truth is, the earliest cut was so small it barely bled. It slipped into our lives disguised as efficiency. It was an ordinary evening, nothing ceremonial. We were sitting at the kitchen table, laptops open, half watching the news. He mentioned, almost casually, that he'd adjusted the payment schedule on one of our joint accounts. I moved some things around, he said, not looking up, just to make it smoother. The word smoother landed gently. It always does. I remember pausing, not because I felt alarmed, but because I felt excluded. Adjusted how? Moved what? I asked a clarifying question lightly, the way you do when you don't want to sound accusatory. He waved it off. It's fine, I already took care of it. That should have been the moment I pressed, not aggressively, just firmly. That should have been the moment I said, we don't take care of shared finances alone. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. I told myself it was efficient, that we trusted each other, that questioning it would make me seem rigid. I'd built my identity on being reasonable, and reasonable women don't interrogate small adjustments. Later that night, when I reviewed the numbers on my own, I noticed the shift. It wasn't large. It didn't destabilize anything. In fact, it worked exactly as he'd said, smoother. That's how the first boundary crossing survived scrutiny. It didn't hurt us immediately. I remember thinking, see, this is why I didn't make a fuss. But something subtle had changed. Not in the numbers, in the process. A decision had been made without me, about something I was responsible for, something we'd always discussed before. And the world didn't end. No alarms went off, no consequences appeared. That's how your internal warning system gets recalibrated. After that, it happened again. A small transfer between accounts. A delayed mention of a purchase already made. Each time the explanation came prepackaged with reassurance. I didn't want to bother you. You had a lot going on. I knew you'd agree anyway. Those phrases sound considerate. They're designed to. They flatter your reasonableness while quietly removing your agency. I noticed. Of course I did. I always notice. But noticing and acting are two different things. And I was still operating under the belief that harmony was fragile, that bringing up discomfort would create problems where none truly existed. So I did what I'd always done. I adjusted internally. I told myself that this was what trust looked like, that we didn't need to micromanage each other, that my discomfort was just the residue of being overly involved before. What I didn't ask myself was a more dangerous question. Why am I the one adjusting every time? The first small cut wasn't about money. It was about permission. He took it because I didn't explicitly withhold it. Permission granted by silence, reinforced by my willingness to smooth over my own unease. Everyone else would have missed it. And that's the thing about these moments. They're invisible to anyone not living inside your skin. If I described it to a friend, it would have sounded petty. He moved some money around. So? Without telling me first. Oh, but it worked, right? Yes, it worked. That's why it mattered. Because when a boundary is crossed and nothing collapses, the crossing becomes easier next time. Not because someone intends harm, but because the absence of resistance reads as acceptance. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't even label it in my mind as disrespect. I stored it away, instead, in the quiet part of my memory where unresolved things wait. At the time, I believed that letting it go was maturity, that I was choosing peace. What I didn't understand yet was that peace chosen at the cost of voice doesn't stay peaceful for long. It just becomes quieter. And the quieter it gets, the harder it is to remember when you stop being asked. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No arguments, no fallout, no sudden shift in how we spoke to each other. That was the most dangerous part. Life continued smooth on the surface, as if nothing meaningful had changed. And because nothing appeared wrong, the pattern was allowed to settle. Decisions started arriving already completed. Not announced, not discussed, just folded casually into conversation. The way you mention the weather after it's already changed. I paid that from the joint account. I moved some funds to cover it. I figured this was the easiest way. Each statement came wrapped in certainty. There was no pause that invited a response, no space left for disagreement. By the time the information reached me, the action was already done. At first, I corrected myself internally. It's not that he didn't ask, I told myself. He just didn't think it was necessary. I framed it as confidence, initiative. I wanted to believe this was growth, not erosion. When I did raise questions, they were met with calm explanations that made my concern feel unnecessary. You're overthinking it. It's not a big deal. You trust me, right? That last one was always delivered gently, almost affectionately, and I hated how effective it was. Trust became the argument that ended all arguments. To question the decision was to question the relationship itself, or so it felt. And I had no interest in turning small logistical issues into existential ones. So I adapted. I checked accounts more often, quietly. I ran numbers late at night without mentioning it. I told myself I was just staying informed. I didn't realize I was compensating for something that should have been shared. Over time, I noticed something else. My input was no longer sought, even when it would have been helpful. Especially then. I'd offer a suggestion, tentatively, and it would be acknowledged politely, then ignored. That's one way to look at it, he'd say, and then proceed exactly as planned. I started choosing my words carefully, trimming them, softening them, turning concerns into observations, observations into questions, questions into silence. Not because he demanded it, but because I wanted to be heard without being dismissed. The irony is, the more carefully I spoke, the less impact my words had. I told myself this was normal, that long-term relationships settle into rhythms, that not every decision needs consensus. That I was being too sensitive, too precise, too attached to the process. What I didn't acknowledge was how one-sided the adaptation had become. He didn't adjust his behavior in response to my discomfort. I adjusted mine to avoid triggering it, and slowly my silence stopped being temporary. It became expected. When friends asked how things were, I said we were good. And we were. By most external measures, no shouting, no obvious neglect, no cruelty, just a quiet assumption that I would accommodate. I normalized it because that's what reasonable people do. They normalize what doesn't hurt enough to protest. They tolerate what doesn't leave visible marks. But inside, something was changing. I started to feel like a consultant who was no longer being consulted. Like a safety net, no one bothered to check for tears. I still carried responsibility without authority, still managed outcomes without shaping decisions. And I told myself it was fine. I told myself that speaking up would make me that person, the difficult one, the one who turns every issue into a discussion. I'd built my life on being the opposite of that. Calm, efficient, easy. What I didn't realize was that ease, when unreciprocated, becomes erasure. There was no single moment when I decided to accept less. It happened through repetition. Each time I chose not to push. Each time I convinced myself that my discomfort was a personal flaw rather than a signal. Disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up as an omission, as being left out of the loop because you'll understand. Having decisions made for you under the assumption that you'll adapt. And the more you adapt, the more invisible your resistance becomes. By the time I noticed how far things had shifted, the pattern felt established. Questioning it now would feel like a disruption, like rewriting rules I had silently agreed to. So I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, not because I didn't notice, but because I had normalized being the one who adjusted. And once disrespect becomes normal, it stops looking like a problem. It starts looking like the cost of keeping things running. It wasn't a conversation. No one sat me down and explained expectations. There was no agreement, no negotiation, no moment where I consciously accepted the role. It was assigned the way habits form, quietly, through repetition, until it feels inevitable. I was the reliable one, the one who would catch what others missed, the one who would smooth over complications before they reached the surface, the one who would adapt so that the system didn't have to. Somewhere along the way, my reliability stopped being appreciated and started being relied upon. At home, this meant I became the buffer, between optimism and reality, between impulse and consequence. If my husband wanted to take a risk, I was expected to absorb the uncertainty. If something went wrong, I was expected to stabilize it, without complaint, without drama. And because I could, everyone assumed I would. I noticed that decisions weren't just being made without me anymore. They were being made because of me, because I would handle the aftermath, because I would find a way to make it work, because I wouldn't explode or withdraw or threaten to leave. My calm had become a resource. When I did express hesitation, it was framed as anxiety rather than insight, as a caution rather than a competence. "You worry too much," he'd say, smiling like it was endearing. "We don't need to overthink everything." Overthinking. That word followed me around like a shadow. It reduced analysis to neurosis. It turned foresight into fear. And after a while, I stopped offering either. I became useful in very specific ways. I organized, I accounted, I remembered. But I wasn't invited into the space where direction was decided. I was supportive, not strategic. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. No one was cruel, no one raised their voice. There were no ultimatums, just a quiet expectation that I would continue to be the steady ground beneath someone else's movement. I told myself this was a partnership. Those roles naturally diverge, that someone has to be the anchor. I didn't ask why that someone was always me. The role came with praise, but it was the kind that keeps you in place. "You're so good at this." "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You're the responsible one." Responsible, as if responsibility were a personality type, not a shared obligation. The more that role solidified, the harder it became to step outside of it. Any deviation felt like a betrayal of expectation. If I questioned a decision, it was met with surprise. Not anger, just confusion, as if I were breaking character. This wasn't who I was supposed to be. I started to see myself through their eyes, not as a partner with equal say, but as a stabilizing force whose job was to absorb friction. I was valued, yes, but in a narrow functional way, and I let it happen. I let it happen because I believed usefulness equaled worth, because I'd been rewarded my whole life for being low maintenance. because I thought asserting myself would disrupt something fragile and important. What I didn't realize was that the fragility was one-sided. The system worked because I bent, because I compensated, because I stayed quiet when my instincts said something was off. My silence wasn't neutral, it was structural. By the time I recognized the role I'd been assigned, it already felt permanent, like trying to change lanes on a road you'd been driving for years. But something in me was beginning to resist. Not loudly, not consciously, but persistently. A sense that this wasn't balanced, that this wasn't mutual. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't planning anything. I was simply noticing that I was reliable, useful, and invisible. Noticing that my calm had been mistaken for consent. Noticing that the role I played served everyone, except me. And once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. The shift didn't happen on a dramatic day. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where I stood up and announced that something was wrong. If you'd looked at my life from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything different at all. That's how internal shifts usually happen, quietly, without witnesses. It was a weekday morning. I remember because the light was flat and gray, the kind that makes everything feel unfinished. I was reviewing our accounts before work, the way I'd started doing habitually, not out of suspicion but out of routine. Numbers don't lie, but they do tell stories, if you know how to read them. Something didn't add up. At first I assumed I'd made a mistake. I rechecked the entries, cross-referenced dates, ran the calculations again. The discrepancy wasn't enormous, but it was undeniable. Money had been moved out of our emergency savings. Not transferred, not reallocated, spent. There was no note, no conversation attached to it, no heads up, just absence. I didn't panic. That surprised me. I didn't feel heat rise in my chest or my pulse spike. What I felt instead was a strange, almost clinical clarity, like a piece clicking into place. I checked again, slower this time. The transaction was clean, intentional, recent. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't oversight. This was a decision. I sat there for a long time after that, hands resting on the desk, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I wasn't rehearsing what I'd say. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was noticing something else entirely. This was the first time he'd crossed a line that couldn't be smoothed over by reassurance. Emergency savings aren't casual. They're not convenience funds. They exist for moments when choice disappears. Illness, job loss, crisis. We'd agreed on that. Explicitly. Or at least, I thought we had. And yet, the money was gone. What shifted in that moment wasn't anger. It was perception. I saw the pattern, not as isolated incidents, but as a trajectory. The small adjustments, the unilateral decisions, the normalization of exclusion. This wasn't impulsive. It was consistent. And I realized something uncomfortable. If I confronted him now, I already knew how the conversation would go. He'd explain. He'd minimize. He'd tell me it was temporary, necessary, handled. He'd say he meant to tell me. That it slipped his mind. I worry too much. And I would be expected to absorb it. Again, for the first time I didn't want to. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I no longer believed a conversation would change anything. That realization was the shift. I closed the laptop and went about my day as usual. I made coffee. I answered emails. I smiled when spoken to. Everything on the outside stayed perfectly intact. Inside, something had recalibrated. I stopped framing my silence as patience. I stopped telling myself that waiting was wisdom. I saw clearly that staying quiet had not preserved trust. It had quietly depleted it. I wasn't hurt yet. Hurt comes later. What I felt was distance. Emotional distance, but also strategic. This wasn't the moment I decided to leave. It wasn't even the moment I decided what I would do. It was the moment I decided to stop explaining things away for him. The moment I accepted that the person I trusted to protect shared boundaries had stopped doing so. That acceptance was sobering. It stripped the situation of excuses. It left only facts. And facts don't argue. They don't raise their voice. They just sit there, waiting to be acknowledged. That morning I didn't confront him. I didn't ask where the money went. Not yet. I did something much quieter. I started listening, not to his words, but to his assumptions. To what he believed I would tolerate. To what he believed he didn't need to explain. And once you start listening at that level, you don't unhear it. The shift wasn't visible, but it was irreversible. Because the moment you stop needing reassurance, you start needing answers. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now, it was deliberate, measured, no longer about preserving peace, but about observing reality without interfering with it. I didn't ask about the emergency savings, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I already understood the pattern well enough to predict it. Asking would trigger explanations. Explanations would demand on emotional labor. And emotional labor, I realized, had become my unpaid role. So I stayed quiet. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the most revealing part. My husband didn't notice my shift because he wasn't listening for it. He interpreted my silence the way he always had, as agreement, or at least as permission. And in that misinterpretation, he relaxed. He spoke more freely, mentioned plans after they'd already been set in motion, referred to decisions as fates accompli. There was a casual confidence in the way he talked about money now, as if the question of whether I'd be consulted had already been settled. I watched, I listened, I didn't interrupt. People often think silence is passive. They imagine it as the absence of thought, of resistance, of will. But silence can also be a position, a way of stepping back far enough to see the whole structure. I started noticing details I'd missed before. How often he framed decisions as temporary to avoid accountability. How he spoke about our finances when it benefited him, and my judgment when it didn't. How he assumed I would always be there to stabilize whatever consequences followed. And because I wasn't challenging him anymore, those assumptions surfaced clearly. He mistook my quiet for weakness. I could see it in the way he stopped justifying things, in the way he summarized instead of explaining, in the way he no longer checked my reaction. There is a particular kind of arrogance that appears when someone believes they no longer need your consent. It's not loud, it's efficient, it moves quickly and assumes compliance. I let him have that illusion, not because I wanted him to underestimate me, but because underestimation reveals truth faster than confrontation ever could. I kept doing what I'd always done on the surface. I paid attention. I handled logistics. I stayed calm. But internally, I stopped absorbing responsibility for decisions I hadn't been part of. That was new. I stopped reframing his choices as misunderstandings. I stopped filling in the gaps with generosity. I allowed his actions to stand on their own, without translation. And that clarity changed how I felt. Not angry, but alert. Silence in that phase was no longer avoidance. It was an assessment. I was learning what happened when I didn't correct, soften, or preempt. I was watching how far things would go if left unchecked. Not to trap him, but to understand the full scope of the dynamic I'd been participating in. The truth is, when you stop interrupting a pattern, it reveals its destination. He didn't become cruel. He became comfortable. And comfort, when built on assumption, can be more dangerous than malice. I began documenting, not dramatically, not obsessively, just notes, dates, transactions, statements made casually that carried weight. Not because I planned to use them, but because I needed a record that wasn't filtered through memory or emotion. For the first time, I trusted my own perception without needing external validation. That trust was quiet, but it was growing. Silence had become a choice, a boundary of its own. And while he believed I was still the same, accommodating, patient, reliable, I was no longer participating in the story he thought we were telling. I was preparing to understand it fully. What they never noticed was not some sudden transformation. I didn't become colder. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't change my tone or my routines. On the surface, I remained exactly who they believed me to be. That was the advantage. People who underestimate you rarely monitor you closely. They assume consistency means stasis. They believe calm equals compliance, and that belief makes them inattentive to anything that doesn't announce itself loudly. So while nothing appeared to change, preparation had already begun. I started by reclaiming information, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise one. I stopped relying on summaries. I reviewed originals, statements, agreements, passwords, policies. I made sure I understood not just what had happened, but how it had been possible. This wasn't paranoia. It was literacy. I realized how many systems I'd been part of without fully controlling. Joint accounts I monitored but didn't restrict. Authorizations I assumed were mutual but weren't. Verbal understandings that had never been formalized because I'd trusted intention over structure. Trust without structure, I learned, is just exposure. I also started paying attention to timing. When decisions were made, when information was shared, when silence was convenient. Patterns aren't visible in isolation. They appear when you step back far enough to see repetition, and repetition tells the truth more reliably than explanation ever will. I noticed how often urgency was used to justify exclusion. How "I'll explain later" became "there wasn't time." How emergencies were defined selectively, serious when action was needed, flexible when accountability was requested. I wasn't angry as I observed this. I was focused. Emotion clouds analysis. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to preserve a version of us that existed mostly in my head. I was trying to understand the one that actually operated day to day. I learned quietly about financial boundaries, about legal defaults, about how shared assets are treated when trust erodes, but paperwork remains unchanged. Not because I was planning an exit, at least not yet, but because knowledge is a form of leverage, whether you use it or not. What they never noticed was that I stopped assuming fairness and started verifying it. I also noticed something else, subtler but just as important. The way people behaved when they believed I would always compensate. Not just my husband, but others too. Friends who leaned without checking the weight. Colleagues who delegated upward without acknowledgement. Once you see how often your presence is treated as infrastructure rather than agency, it's hard to ignore. I didn't confront any of it. Confrontation would have altered the data. People behave differently when they know they're being watched. I needed to see what happened when they believed nothing had changed. And what happened was this. Boundaries continued to be crossed. More confidently now, less carefully. Not because he was reckless, but because he felt safe. Safe in the assumption that I would adapt, that I would fix, that I would smooth things over. That assumption was the most honest thing he ever gave me. I documented without drama. I asked neutral questions when clarity was required. I listened more than I spoke. And I stopped volunteering solutions. That last part was difficult. I'd spent years stepping in before problems became visible. Now, I let small gaps remain. Not to punish, but to observe who noticed them. Most didn't. And that told me everything I needed to know about how replaceable my labor was perceived to be, and how irreplaceable it actually was. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was simply assembling a complete picture. One that didn't rely on trust to fill in missing pieces. What they never noticed was that while I was still present, I was no longer positioned beneath them. I was beside the facts. And once you stand there long enough, clarity stops being painful. It becomes grounding. The private reveal didn't arrive like a shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I had to sit down and steady myself. It came the way truth often does, quietly. After enough pieces line up, that denial becomes unnecessary. I was reviewing documents late one evening, not because I suspected something new, but because I'd grown accustomed to understanding things fully before letting them rest. Statements, confirmations, timelines. Everything I needed was already there. I just hadn't assembled it all in one place before. When I did, the picture became unmistakable. The emergency savings hadn't been spent impulsively. It hadn't been a last-minute decision or a desperate move. It had been planned, calculated. The timing aligned with other actions, commitments made elsewhere, obligations I hadn't been told about, risks I hadn't agreed to share. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a choice made with the assumption that I would find out later and accept it. That realization settled in slowly, not as betrayal, but as clarity. I saw how my silence had been interpreted not as patience, but as predictability. I had become a known quantity, reliable, absorbing, forgiving by default. I also saw something else, how little room there had been for me in the decision at all. There were emails I hadn't been copied on, conversations that had happened without me by design, not accident, language that framed the situation as already handled before I ever entered the frame. It wasn't secrecy in the dramatic sense. It was exclusion through efficiency. And once I saw that, I stopped asking why he'd done it. The answer was obvious. Because he could. Because there had been no consequences before. Because my role in the system was to stabilize outcomes, not influence direction. The private reveal wasn't just about what he'd done. It was about what I had been enabling without realizing it. That was the hardest part. I didn't feel shame, but I did feel responsibility. Not for his actions, but for my participation in a dynamic that allowed them to happen unchecked. I had mistaken trust for safety and silence for strength, and yet I didn't feel regret either, because understanding arrived before anything irreversible had happened to me. The money was gone, yes, but more importantly, the illusion was gone too. And illusions are far more expensive in the long run. I didn't confront him after the reveal, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation would have centered his explanation, his reasoning, his version of events. This clarity wasn't something I needed to be validated. It was something I needed to act on, carefully, quietly, and without drama. I remember closing the folder and sitting there in the dark, not feeling numb, not feeling furious, just steady, as if something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing it had been set down. This was the moment I understood leverage, not as power over someone, but as freedom from being dependent on their honesty. Knowledge doesn't demand action immediately. It offers options. And for the first time in a long time, I had them. I didn't celebrate the discovery. There was no satisfaction in being right, just a calm acceptance that the marriage I thought I had and the one I was actually living in were not the same thing. That acceptance didn't break me. It clarified me, because once you see the truth privately, without witnesses, without noise, you're no longer reacting. You're choosing. And that is where real power begins. Clarity creates options, but it also removes excuses. Once I understood what had happened, and how deliberately, it became impossible to pretend I was merely confused or overly cautious. I was standing at a decision point, whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. There were several paths available to me. I examined each one carefully, without emotion, the way I evaluate risk at work. I could confront him immediately, lay everything out, demand explanations, apologies, assurances. That path promised release, maybe even validation. But I knew it well. I'd walked versions of it before. It led to conversations that sounded productive but changed very little. Words would fill the space where action should have been. I could stay silent and adapt, as I always had, rebuild the savings slowly, absorb the loss, tighten my systems, protect us from the consequences of his decisions without ever addressing the cause. That path promised stability, but at the cost of self-respect. And I already knew where it ended. I could leave, cleanly, quietly, without discussion. That option existed too, but leaving without understanding the full implications, legal, financial, emotional, would have been another version of acting without complete information. And I had learned not to do that anymore. Each option carried weight. None of them was easy, but only one of them was irreversible in a way that mattered. I chose the one that changed my position, not just my circumstances. I decided to stop participating in a system where my consent was assumed rather than requested. That decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve ultimatums or deadlines. It involved a shift in how I engage with reality. I stopped viewing the marriage as something to be preserved at all costs. Instead, I began evaluating it the way I would any other long-term structure, by its integrity, its transparency, and its sustainability. And by those measures, something fundamental had already failed. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't need to. Decisions don't require witnesses to be valid. What made it irreversible wasn't what I did next. It was what I stopped doing. I stopped covering gaps. I stopped translating his intentions into palatable explanations. I stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes I hadn't agreed to. Once you stop doing those things, the system either recalibrates or it reveals how dependent it was on your silence. I understood that whatever followed, the relationship could not return to its previous state. Not because of anger, but because awareness can't be undone. You can't unknow how trust was broken or how easily it was replaced with assumption. This wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. I chose the option that allowed me to remain intact, even if everything else shifted. That choice came with uncertainty. I knew there would be consequences, discomfort, confusion, possibly even conflict. But none of that scared me as much as the idea of continuing as if nothing had happened. I wasn't closing a door yet. I was stepping out of a room I'd been standing in too long, waiting for someone else to notice I was there. The decision point wasn't a moment of courage. It was a moment of honesty. And once I chose myself, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, there was no going back to who I'd been before. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not because nothing was happening, but because nothing needed to be announced. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without explanation, without spectacle, without inviting interference. For the first time in a long while, I allowed my actions to be private, not secretive, intentional. I started with structure. I separated what needed to be separate, not emotionally yet, but practically. I clarified what was legally shared and what wasn't. I opened accounts in my own name, not as a statement, but as a safeguard. I redirected my income accordingly, calmly, methodically, the way I handle any long-term risk mitigation. There was no rush. Urgency benefits mistakes. I reviewed policies I'd skimmed before, read clauses I'd trusted without verifying. I made sure I understood what silence had cost me and what clarity could protect. At home, nothing changed on the surface. I still asked how his day was, still handled logistics, still showed up. That was important. Sudden shifts raise questions. Questions invite control. I wasn't ready for either. He didn't notice the adjustments because they didn't inconvenience him. And that, in itself, was telling. People notice change when it disrupts their comfort. As long as things continue to work, they assume nothing meaningful has shifted. I also stopped offering future guarantees. When conversations drifted toward plans, big ones, vague ones, I responded neutrally. No objections, no enthusiasm, just acknowledgement. I didn't commit myself emotionally to outcomes I no longer had influence over. This wasn't manipulation. It was honesty without disclosure. I sought advice quietly. Not from people who would inflame the situation, but from professionals who understood systems better than emotions. I asked questions, hypotheticals. I listened more than I spoke. Each answer gave me more certainty, not about what I should do, but about what I could do. That distinction mattered. The more I moved in silence, the clearer it became how much of our shared life had depended on my invisible coordination. Small things began to wobble, not catastrophically, just enough to be noticed by me. Bills that needed reminders, tasks that waited longer than usual, decisions that stalled without my prompting. I didn't step in immediately, not to teach a lesson, but to see what would happen. What happened was subtle frustration on his end, confusion, mild irritation that things didn't move as smoothly as before. He didn't connect it to me, not consciously. He just assumed something external was causing the drag. I let that assumption stand. Moving in silence isn't about withdrawal. It's about repositioning. I was no longer the foundation that absorbed everything. I was becoming a participant again, one with boundaries, with options, with autonomy. The quietest change was internal. I stopped rehearsing explanations, stopped preparing to justify my feelings, stopped anticipating how to make things easier for someone who hadn't made them easier for me. That freed up a surprising amount of mental space. I slept better, thought more clearly, reacted less. And while he still believed nothing had changed, the truth was that the ground beneath us had already shifted. He just hadn't felt it yet. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience, confusion, or bad timing. And when you've spent years absorbing friction for someone else, the moment you stop can feel, to them, like something has suddenly gone wrong. To me, it felt like gravity returning to its natural setting. The first signs were small, a missed payment reminder, a delay in something that usually moves faster. A question was asked twice because it hadn't been tracked the way it used to be. None of it was catastrophic, but it was unfamiliar. He started commenting on it without quite understanding what he was noticing. "Things feel a little disorganized lately," he said once, half joking. "Maybe we've both just been busy." We. That word did a lot of work. I nodded, let the explanation stand. I wasn't going to correct a narrative that was finally testing itself. What he was experiencing wasn't punishment. It was exposure. The systems he'd relied on, without fully acknowledging who maintained them, were no longer being quietly reinforced. And for the first time, the cost of assumption became visible. He began asking more questions, not about the emergency savings, not about the decisions already made, but about logistics, about timing, about details he'd never had to hold before. Where before I would have anticipated and answered, now I responded when asked, and only when asked. clearly, calmly, without adding extra layers of protection. This wasn't withdrawal, it was proportional engagement. At work, I'd seen this pattern many times. When someone stops compensating for inefficiencies, the system doesn't collapse. It reveals its weak points. That's what was happening at home. He felt unsettled, though he couldn't name why. I noticed the shift in his tone before I noticed it in his behavior. Less certainty, more checking. A subtle edge of concern when things didn't resolve as easily as expected. Did you handle that already? Do you know what's going on with this? Each question carried an assumption that I was still overseeing everything in the background. I answered honestly, but briefly. No. I haven't looked at it yet. I thought you were managing that. There was no accusation in my voice, no satisfaction, just accuracy. Accuracy is surprisingly disarming. At first he seemed irritated, not at me directly, but at the situation, as if reality itself had become less cooperative. He worked longer hours, made quicker decisions, tried to regain momentum, but without the quiet counterbalance I used to provide, those decisions had weight. I watched him begin to feel something new, uncertainty, not panic, not fear, just the dawning realization that things didn't automatically resolve anymore, that some outcomes depended on coordination that had previously been invisible. And still, I didn't bring up the emergency savings. That was important, because the consequences I wanted him to experience weren't about guilt, they were about awareness. Awareness can't be argued with. It doesn't respond to explanation. It either arrives or it doesn't. He started asking if something was wrong. Are you okay? You seem different. Different, not distant, not cold, just different. I told him the truth. I'm fine. And I was. What he felt wasn't my withdrawal. It was the absence of my overextension. For the first time, the imbalance wasn't cushioned. And without that cushion, he had to feel the uneven ground beneath us. I didn't rush to resolve his discomfort. I didn't frame it as a relationship issue. I let it remain what it was, a natural consequence of a system no longer being silently managed. That's when the loss began. Not of money, but of certainty. The certainty that things would always work out without his full participation. The certainty that my calm meant everything was under control. The certainty that trust could be assumed without maintenance. And once certainty leaves, it rarely returns on command. Panic doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like sudden attentiveness, like concern that arrives a little too late, like questions that should have been asked months ago, delivered now with an edge of urgency that gives them away. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the ground had already shifted beneath both of us. He started checking in more, asking about things he'd never taken any interest in before. Not casually, carefully, as if precision itself might repair what he couldn't yet name. Did you see this charge? Should we talk through next month? I think we should be more aligned. Aligned. That word appeared often, as if naming it could restore it. I listened. I answered when necessary. I didn't mirror his urgency, because what he was responding to wasn't the emergency savings. Not yet. It was the discomfort of losing his assumptions. The quiet realization that the system he trusted had stopped absorbing impact. And once that happens, people scramble, not always to fix the cause, but to restore the feeling of safety they'd grown accustomed to. He became more conciliatory, more agreeable, less decisive. He'd pause before acting now, glance in my direction, wait for cues that no longer came. This was the stage where things could have been addressed, months earlier, when trust still existed in usable form, when apology might have meant repair. But now the timing was wrong, because his concern wasn't rooted in accountability. It was rooted in instability. I could feel it in the way he spoke, careful not to upset me, but not fully understanding why upsetting me suddenly mattered. He wanted reassurance, confirmation that the old dynamic was still intact. It wasn't. And the hardest truth I had to accept was this. Once someone starts panicking about consequences, they're rarely ready to examine the behavior that created them. I didn't shut him down. I didn't accuse. I didn't remind him of the money yet. I simply stayed grounded in what I now knew. That made him more unsettled than any confrontation could have. He tried to initiate conversations that circled the issue without touching it. Talking about communication in general, about stress, about being a team. All reasonable things, delivered too late to land where they once might have. I could see the regret forming, not sharp, not fully articulated, but present. Regret for comfort lost, for ease disrupted, for certainty eroded. But regret without understanding doesn't rebuild trust. It only expresses loss. At one point, he asked almost carefully, "Do you still trust me?" It was the first time he'd ever asked. And in that moment, I understood how far apart we already were. Because trust isn't something you request once it's gone. It's something you maintain long before you fear losing it. I didn't answer immediately, not to punish, but because honesty requires space. "I'm still here," I said finally. It wasn't reassurance, it was a fact. By then, the emergency savings had become symbolic, not of money lost, but of a boundary crossed with confidence. A line moved because it was assumed it wouldn't matter. He was trying to fix the atmosphere. I was evaluating the structure, and structures don't respond to mood. By the time he was ready to talk seriously, really talk, I had already done the work of understanding what had broken and what it would take to rebuild it. The truth was difficult, but clear. Even if he returned the money, even if he apologized perfectly, even if he promised transparency going forward, something essential had already changed. Because trust isn't restored by urgency, and repair doesn't happen when one person is already bracing for impact. It was too late to fix it the way he wanted to, not because I was unforgiving, but because I had already stepped into clarity. And clarity doesn't move backward to preserve comfort. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no dramatic buildup. We were sitting across from each other, the day already spent. The house quiet in the way it gets when there's nothing left to distract from what hasn't been said. I didn't initiate it out of anger. I initiated it because there was no longer any value in postponing clarity. "I know about the emergency savings," I said. That was it. No preamble, no accusation, just a statement of fact. He froze. Not visibly, not theatrically, but in the small ways people do when they realize something important has shifted. His eyes searched my face, not for fury but for cues, tone, emotion, permission to respond the way he always had. I gave him none. He started explaining immediately. Of course he did. The reasons came out practiced, logical, and almost relieved to finally be spoken. Timing, opportunity, temporary risk. He told me he'd meant to explain, that he didn't want to worry me. He planned to replace the money. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't there to debate facts. I was there to name impact. When he finished, he waited for reassurance, for my usual translation of his intentions into something workable. I didn't offer it. "I'm not upset," I said calmly. And that part was true. But I am clear. That unsettled him more than anger would have. I told him what he'd done. Not in numbers, but in meaning. That he'd made a unilateral decision about our shared safety. That he'd crossed a boundary we'd both understood, even if we hadn't documented it. That he'd assumed my consent because I hadn't withheld it loudly enough before. He tried to apologize. The words were there. The tone was careful. But an apology without comprehension has a hollow sound. "I didn't think you'd react like this," he said. And there it was. "I'm reacting exactly the way I always have," I replied, quietly. "The difference is I'm no longer absorbing it for you." That landed. I didn't threaten. I didn't list consequences. I didn't demand change. I explained, plainly, that trust, once broken this way, doesn't shatter. It thins. And when it thins enough, it can't hold weight anymore. I told him I wasn't interested in promises, or urgency, or reassurance was offered only after the system faltered. What I needed was inclusion, I said, before the decision, not justification after it. He nodded. I could see the realization trying to catch up to the moment, but realization takes time, and I was no longer waiting. The confrontation wasn't a turning point, it was a confirmation. I wasn't angry because anger still hopes to be heard. I had already heard everything I needed. When the conversation ended, nothing dramatic followed. No slammed doors, no ultimatums, just a quiet understanding that something had been named, and naming it made pretending impossible. We sat there for a while after, not in hostility, in recognition, and that was enough. I'm not the woman I was at the beginning of this story, not because something was taken from me, but because something was returned. Clarity has a way of doing that. It strips away the roles you didn't consciously choose and hands you back the parts of yourself you'd been setting aside in the name of being reasonable. Who I am now is quieter in a different way. I still don't raise my voice. I still value calm. But my calm no longer comes from suppression. It comes from alignment, from knowing where I stand, what I accept, and what I no longer negotiate internally. I don't rush to smooth things over anymore. Not because I want conflict, but because harmony that depends on one person bending isn't harmony at all. It's an imbalance with good manners. I've learned that being dependable doesn't mean being endlessly available. That competence doesn't require invisibility. That trust is not proven by silence, but by shared responsibility. I no longer assume good intentions are enough. I look for structure, transparency, mutual process, not because I've become cynical, but because I've become precise. There's no bitterness here. That surprises people when they hear the story. They expect anger, resentment, a sharp edge. What they don't realize is that bitterness requires longing for things to have been different. I've let that go. I don't measure my worth by how much I can carry for others anymore. I don't volunteer my stability as a safety net unless I've agreed to be part of the planning. I still believe in partnership, but partnership now means inclusion, not assumption. Dialogue, not damage control. The biggest change is internal. I trust myself. I trust my instincts when something feels off. I trust my discomfort as information, not weakness. I trust my silence when it's chosen and my voice when it's needed. I'm no longer afraid that speaking will make me too much, because I've learned that being easy often means being expendable. Who I am now is someone who pays attention early, who doesn't wait for permission to protect herself, who understands that emotional justice doesn't arrive through punishment, but through refusing to participate in dynamics that diminish you. If there's a quiet dominance in that, it's not about control, it's about presence. I'm present in my own life again, fully, without apology. And that, more than anything else, is what changed. This story doesn't end with a victory speech. There's no dramatic payoff, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense and feels fair. Real life rarely offers that kind of closure. What it offers instead is alignment. Looking back, I don't think the most painful part was the money. It was realizing how quietly trust can be spent when no one is watching. How easily love can coexist with assumption. How often harm isn't caused by cruelty, but by confidence that someone else will absorb the impact. Trust breaks quietly, then all at once. It doesn't shatter in a single moment. It thins, it stretches, it gets leaned on one time too many. And by the time someone notices the strain, it's already past the point where reassurance can fix it. The lesson I carry forward isn't about control or punishment. It's about responsibility, shared responsibility. About understanding that silence is not consent and calm is not infinite capacity. I learned that being the strong one can become a trap if no one asks how much strength costs. That reliability, when taken for granted, turns into expectation. And expectation, when left unchecked, erodes respect. There is a quiet kind of justice in choosing not to participate in dynamics that require you to disappear. Not loudly, not angrily, just definitely. I don't regret staying as long as I did. I did the best I could with the information I had. And when I had better information, I made different choices. That's not weakness, that's growth. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Pay attention to the moments you explain away, the small discomforts you smooth over, the times you tell yourself it's not worth mentioning. Those moments are rarely small. They're often early. You don't need to explode to be taken seriously. You don't need to dramatize pain for it to be valid. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop compensating and let reality speak for itself. And now I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was costing you something important? If you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Not to relive it, not to judge anyone, but to name it, because naming things is how we stop carrying them alone. Thank you for listening.